as a kid, as a teenager, I only made sense in the city of Bellingham, Washington, if my parents were right nearby. So if I'm walking around holding hands with my mom, people would go up to her and say, wow, what a great thing you've done. Like, they recognize that she has adopted me. Oh, okay, you're a safe Black person because you're with this woman who did this great thing. You know, but when I wasn't with my parents and I'm just a Black girl out in this city, there is confusion. Like, how did you get here? Why are you here? Who are you?
Angela Tucker is a Black woman who was adopted by white parents as a very young child. This is called transracial adoption, and Angela says adoptees like her grow up wrestling with complicated feelings of gratitude and love, but also rejection, loss, and confusion. In her new book, Angela invites us to take the perspective of the adopted child and to imagine what it would be like to wonder where you came from, to experience racial confusion, and to long for lost connections. She founded the Adoptee Mentoring Society to work with other adoptees and to foster more honest conversations about adoption. She joins us in this episode to talk about her new book, You Should Be Grateful: Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and this is Relationscapes. We're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other so we can build a more just world together. Angela Tucker joins us. She's author of You Should Be Grateful: Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption. Angela, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with introductions. I borrowed this first question from your book where you describe mentoring transracial adoptees. Please share your name, your gender pronouns, and how you feel about adoption today.
My name is Angela Tucker. I go by she, her pronouns, and how I feel about adoption today is a huge question.
Well, I got it from you, so.
Wow. Adoption is so complicated. I mean, I think in general society thinks of adoption as really a beautiful thing. And that typically comes from the perspective of adoptive parents. And so, my whole work is trying to center the adoptee's perspective on adoption, which isn't necessarily the complete opposite, but it's just a little bit more nuanced than just a kind of fairy tale Annie type story.
This is a question that I see you have asked a lot of your counseling groups. You lead sessions with people who are adopted, and you lead with this to kind of signal, I think, to them that their feelings might change over time. I think sometimes people get a story about their life and they're just prepared to share that story. And so when you're sitting down with kids and asking them this question, how do you feel about it today? Their answers may vary. And so you, as a person who's been adopted, like, where are you at with it today coming into this interview?
Yeah, the question I have never had turned around on me, but yes, I do ask it of all the people that I mentor. And yeah, the reason is just because it's so common that folks put their thoughts about our adoption on us. And so I am attempting to give my mentees, whether they're young tweens or teens or even adults, the freedom to understand that it can change from day to day to day. So yeah, for me, I do a lot of consulting with prospective adopters, and it's frustrating. I would say this is like current. So as of yesterday's work, just frustrating to work with folks who really, really want a baby. They want a child. They want to become a parent, and that they've found adoption as the way to do that. It's frustrating because that's really not what adoption is for. And so this equation, which I can understand how it seems like it would make sense, makes things really tricky because it makes it hard for the prospective adopters to really have a great understanding about keeping the biological family in your life, because what they really want is their own child to like mold and grow as if it's their own child. That's just not what adoption is. So that's the irksome conundrum that I find myself in while I'm doing like consulting with families.
Let's talk a little bit about your background. So you're a Black person who's adopted by white parents. You talk about them as being sort of progressive and earth conscious and kind of attuned to, social justice issues. But there was still, for you growing up, it was interesting to learn about their background and then how that affected you as a person who was adopted into a white family in a very white context.
Yeah. My parents were certifiable hippies of the 70s. And they adopted 7 of us, all from foster care. And their view really was more of the zero population growth group I talk about, how they bought into that idea that we didn't need to be procreating at the rate that we were. And so they wanted to adopt. And so I didn't have those kind of ownership-like feelings that I notice with a lot of my clients. They were really wishing that all of us could have relationships with our birth parents, but we couldn't for one reason or another.
Right. And we'll talk about that. And that makes a big difference, what an adoptee's relationship is with their birth parents, whether there can even be one or not. Your intro to the book begins with something that you wrote. It's called An Adoptee Manifesto. And I wondered if you could read that for us here.
Sure. Yes.
And this kind of gives us a sense of where you're coming from and kind of what you're fighting for.
Yes. An Adoptee Manifesto. We can love more than one set of parents. Relationships with our birth parents, foster parents, and our adoptive parents are not mutually exclusive. We have the right to own our original birth certificate. Curiosity about our roots is innate. We need access to our family medical history. The pre-verbal memories we have with our first family are real. Postnatal culture shock exists. It's okay to feel a mixture of gratitude and loss. We are not alone. We have each other.
It's a beautiful manifesto, and we'll touch on points of it as we go through the interview. But I wondered when this originated. When did you write the actual manifesto? Was it part of the book or something you'd done beforehand?
I wrote just a series of statements after I would be on. It was always on an airplane coming back from doing a keynote speech somewhere. Each of these lines were things that I had to find myself to telling myself on the airplane. So I would go give a keynote speech and I might be barraged with audience members who would ask questions like, well, why do you really need to know your medical history? You've got great parents and they took such great care of you and they took you to doctors and stuff. And at that particular speech would be defending why I needed to know my medical history. And then, so every single statement was me on an airplane, ruminating over that one thing. Well, why do I need to know that? And is it my right? And so over time, I kind of collated all of those together and at a certain point wrote them all down in one document. And instead of being the flight home from a speech, the flight to a speech, I read all of them in one fell swoop and found a sense of power. And then I started sharing it with other adoptees that I mentor. And they were like, wow, it's so simple. Things like we can love all of our parents, but to say it out loud and to say that it's not mutually exclusive feels really empowering. So after I had collated all of these together, I thought, and I started sharing them with others, I just thought, why don't I create it into a beautiful manifesto? So I had someone design it, the lettering, the font, and put it up on my wall. And then I started using it as a tool with other adoptive parents who were a little skeptical to say, what would happen if you put this on your wall for your adopted child to see? And then that started creating a sense of empowerment for the kids. And so that was really kind of the iteration of how it came to be.
All right. As I said, we'll hit on some pieces of the manifesto throughout our discussion, but let's also talk about how tricky the discussion itself can be. In your introduction, you write that being honest about adoption is a tricky minefield to navigate because regardless of your own stance, somebody inevitably seems to get hurt. So what kind of mines are you trying to avoid in the minefield?
It's so many people's emotions, so many people's good intentions, so many assumptions that this is the best thing for us. So I feel like there's the minefield of the prospective adopters who maybe just want to help, or they'll say that. And for me, I'm trying to articulate how, like specifically for white parents who say we will adopt a child of any color, I want to speak in a kind way, but to show them that perhaps that isn't the most responsible thing to do, given their place, or given people's desires for Black and brown families to start adopting at the same rate as white, kind of entitled middle-class families seem to do. And then I'm also working around, like in my story, my birth mother's her deep feelings of shame that she has around the time that she placed me for adoption. She doesn't really remember very much about that time. And so for me to even bring it up, and working on this book was part of that, inevitably triggers her into a space that's really dark and sad. But when I'm talking with her about it, I am sometimes trying to advocate for her to say, you really should have had more support. But in even saying that, it reminds her of what she didn't have and what she couldn't do, which was keep me.
Right.
For social workers, I also feel like it's a minefield because many of them are just doing the best they can with what they have and the knowledge that they know. But obviously, it's not good enough if we have 1 in 4 adoptees who are in therapy seeking suicide. So something isn't right there either. So I think the minefield, if I could sum it up, is just people's good intentions are all over adoption. It's rare that I meet folks who really want to harm people. Like, that's not people's goal.
Right.
And so to be critical of it is definitely weighing everyone's perspective all at the same time, it feels like.
Right. And I think the title itself speaks to that, the idea that you should be grateful, a statement that adoptees often hear. And that, as you point out in the book, that some adoptees kind of tell themselves, even when they don't really feel it, right?
It's gaslighting, and it's not gaslighting at the same time. I mean, people would say this to me all the time, but they didn't even know my birth parents. I didn't know my birth parents. I didn't know anything about what my life would have been like, but there's that assumption that I got a better life. Certainly, I got a different life, and I have really great parents and grew up in a city, even though it was predominantly white, was a pretty great place to grow up in the Pacific Northwest. But the should part, in the book I write that the word should to me feels like a combination of judgment and failure at the same time. Before I've even done anything. And that is irksome. And I also understand where it's coming from.
Is that because you can feel some gratitude? Like, I mean, you clearly care for your adoptive parents so much. And so just like so many kids can be grateful for their parents. And so the phrase is complicated. And I think it's part of the problem is it seems to really hem everything in. It's very limiting. Instead of saying like, what are you grateful for? Or what is there to be grateful for? It's like, well, you should be grateful. Here is the story. This is all that you should really focus on. And it's not curious at all.
Right. Yeah, I talk in the book a lot about the things that I'm really grateful for, which this idea that I am grateful for the family that I have, yet I am not grateful to have been adopted. It's like an ever so slight difference, but it makes all the difference to me.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us wish to be adopted, nor do birth parents want to be birth parents. That so much else happens. And yes, we can still have gratitude for the family that we find ourselves within.
I haven't had any like close friends who were adoptees. I don't have any direct relatives that are adoptees. I think grappling with it came through popular culture and media, and most recently through NBC's This Is Us, which follows the story of adoptees, one of whom is a transracial adoptee, and who has become, that character has become such a, in my life, an important role model of fatherhood. And to see the story play out of the complications of adoption, like for people who haven't seen the series, it's a couple who adopts. They have two kids and adopt a third child, and Randall is black. And especially toward the end of the series, you get to see more of the racial dynamics play out. And I think you consulted on the show, right?
I consulted on the last season. Yeah, so season 5 for Randall's character.
There was so much there, and there was so much in that show and in your book that really put my eyes on what the adoptees themselves thought, and that's really important. You call it adoptee centrism. As you said, a lot of the stories take the perspective of parents and a whole family. Like, parents wanted a child, they either couldn't have one or for other reasons adopted. That's the story, rather than what's happening to the person being adopted. So talk a little bit more about that adoptee centrism.
It's funny how when I talk about adoption and when I was consulting with the writers of This Is Us for Randall, there is this idea of like, wow, I've never thought of it that way. And then, oh, how obvious that is, like at the same time. But in adoption, I often talk about how we are kind of wedged between someone's great joy, which is the adoptive parents often, and someone's extreme pain, which is the birth parents oftentimes. And the fact that media hasn't spent much time on our perspective of what that feels like to be in between both, that we often hear about kind of probably the most critique from media is this savior attitude that adoptive parents might have. You hear about white saviorism, but the space of wishing we could be with our birth family, perhaps understanding why we can't, that's the story that I'm trying to tell and promote. Adoptee centrism, I think, hasn't been mainstreamed because there seems to be a big threat, especially to adoptive parents, when adoptees speak out. I am grateful that my parents don't seem to have that they're very open to my viewpoint on all of this, but I know a lot of adoptees will say, like, well, one thing I talk about in my book is how many adult adoptees say, I want to find my birth parents, but I'm going to wait until my adoptive parents die before I start. And that's because they're trying to show love for their adoptive parents, and they don't want them to feel like put off or like they're not thankful for all they did. And so many stories I know, right when their adoptive parents pass away, these adoptees go try to search. And those are really sad stories often because birth parents sometimes have passed away too by that point.
I think taking the perspective of adoptees is really, really helpful. And your book has a lot of voices in there, a lot of different people that you talk to help give people a sense of adoptees' perspectives. And you also give kind of a history of transracial adoption in particular. And there's a startling moment in your first chapter that I wanted to bring up here. You describe a meet and greet that happened after your documentary Closure was screened. This is a documentary about your experience. And a black woman approached you and told you that you were her worst fears realized, and said that you're not a true black person. And this chapter is helpful because it puts her comment into historical context about what she could have meant by that. So why would someone say something like that you're her worst fears realized and that there's something questionable about your blackness?
Yeah, that was a really hard moment. But the woman who told me this was a member of the National Association of Black Social Workers. In 1972, that group called transracial adoption cultural genocide because they felt like white people weren't going to adequately imbue the skills we need to traverse America and its racism. So the group wasn't saying that white parents couldn't parent us, but that we would have to do a lot of code switching and essentially become way familiar with whiteness, and perhaps at a really terrible cost. And so in my speech, I was essentially saying that in a positive way. I was talking about how comfortable I felt in both white and black spaces, and as a result of growing up transracially adopted, even though I did talk about finding my blackness and being really proud of who I was, didn't come until I was in my college years and got away from that predominantly white city. But that was exactly what this woman wanted to work against. So she, in her career, was trying to avoid adoptees kind of having to feel that split. And so with my speech, I basically confirmed that it's still happening. And I didn't know all of that when she told me that I was her worst fear realized. And so
Wow.
I was really shocked, and more than shocked. I mean, to have a Black woman say that to me was really tough. But as I reflected on it against that backdrop, I had an understanding. I mean, it's similar to how hard I'm working to ensure that adoptees are no longer in closed adoptions. And if I went to a speech in 20 years and someone came through a closed adoption, I don't know that I would go right up to them and say that, but I would be frustrated about my life's work.
Right. Closed adoption, meaning that there's no connection between adoptees and their birth parents, and that there's really no way to find them. You're basically not allowed to, whether the records are hidden or, whatever, closed adoption. I want to talk a little bit more about the history. The first recorded transracial adoption in the United States that we know of, you say happened in 1948. That's not all that long ago. And then in the 1950s, there's kind of a rise of a sort of paternalistic kind of racism. Like white people were saying, oh, we need to uplift Black people. We can do this through adoption, or Black people are less fit as parents, and so we should, bring Black children into white families and so on. And then that's kind of the context that the National Association of Black Social Workers was protesting against and saying there was racial genocide in the 70s, which to me made total sense historically to see why they would have those problems. But then in the 1980s, which is around the time you were adopted, there was a kind of rise of this colorblind, feel-good, post-racial kind of vibe. And it's sort of like, we don't care if a child, what color they are. We would welcome any child into our family, which on the surface seems great, right? It seems not racist, but in ignoring the experience of race in America, it ends up overlooking really important aspects of what it means to be Black and what it means to be white. So a colorblind, feel-good kind of adoption is actually kind of problematic. And you talk about this in the book.
Yeah, so problematic. Yeah, I remember actually wearing a t-shirt that says, "Love sees no color." I think that was like a common adage back in the early 90s, maybe.
Yeah, that was my youth. That was like, I don't see color was kind of the thing, right?
I like the upgraded term for color blindness, which is color evasiveness. Because it doesn't let white people off the hook to say, like, I just don't see it. Because actually you do, and you're choosing not to see a certain color, certain races. But in doing that, we're only upholding whiteness as the status quo.
Right.
So to say, like, I love you no matter what, you're beautiful no matter what, but we're going to put you in this predominantly white space means that we really want you to assimilate to be just like them. And we're not going to celebrate any aspect of what makes you, you. That idea is really covert. It comes across when, people like myself wanted to have hair that flowed in the wind like my mom's. I didn't want to have my afro. Like that could be interpreted as just individuation and just trying new things and hairstyles, or we could see it through the race of colorblindness, and it's where, of course, I'm going to want to fit in with the culture around me. I know so many families who would just choose to see it as the former, as just self-exploration, and put us in a all-Black place, and we likely wouldn't be so keen to have our hair look like Eurocentric flow in the wind. We still have it a little bit because that's what is in popular culture. So you just have to work really hard to embrace and to see race. I mean, we really want parents to see our color because once we do that, there's so much historically and in our culture that we can seriously celebrate. But also there's that piece of, if you want to avoid talking about race, then it must mean that you don't love my birth family, is how it feels way deep down.
Right. And you also kind of talk about how growing up in a white house, it might be like the way that you talk, the way that you dress, the kind of things that you enjoy. You know, if you're more surrounded by white folks and not as invested in Black culture, that can be reflected in how you talk and how you act and things. And then other Black folks might look at that and say, oh, you know, I think Oreo, I don't remember if the book uses the word Oreo or not, but it's this kind of derogatory way of saying like Black on the outside, white on the inside.
Yeah. I do talk about the Oreo in the sense when I'm working with a group of adoptees, transracial adoptees at a transracial adoption camp, that this group of boys talk about this word Oreo and how they are called that and what that means to them. And in the book, you can see their struggle with accepting that reality and kind of believing it, and then also wanting to push back against it because they understand that there are aspects that of themselves that don't fit with the societal view of Blackness. I try to teach that Blackness is not a monolith, but that's something that I didn't learn until later on. You know, I didn't really truly believe that there could be like Black nerds, you know, people like Black folks like me who love to read. And like, I really did buy into the narrative that Black folks are only athletes, or, you know, it's just so narrow. But how do you know that if you aren't immersed in the culture? It still is a prevalent term, and I like to point people to Susan Harris O'Connor's research, where she talks about the 5 different identities of transracial adoptees and how they are tricky, that our genetic identity might not match up with our feeling identity. Like, we know that I know I'm a Black woman, but I may have a feeling that I really can identify with whiteness. And of course I can, if that's all that I was raised in. I mean, that has changed in my adulthood, thankfully, but it would make sense. And so I try to give transracial adoptees a little more latitude and some language around the expansiveness of our identities. It's nice because I think it's not just limited to transracial adoption anymore, that there are so many different groups of people who are grappling with what it means to belong. And that's really kind of a surprise that I've found with my book coming out, how many people who aren't related to transracial adoption but are like, I feel myself in your book.
Because they sense that identity tension, like the kind of different tensions that a lot of different people can feel. And your book explores how that plays out in the context of adoption. But I do think there's access there for anyone who's sort of tried to find a place or tried to fit in or had questions about their identity. I think LGBTQ issues fit in here and especially for folks who are trans, who are sort of dealing with gender expectations as they grow up. And so there's a lot of different touch tones here, I think, for a lot of different readers.
Pushing back against the status quo, and our world is expanding on so many binaries that we've had. And that, I think that is exactly the transracial adoptee experience.
Right. And your chapter, White Privilege by Osmosis, this kind of talks about these exact issues, about not being seen as Black enough to some people, maybe being seen as too Black for others, but also, this was interesting to me, the kind of proximal privilege, I think is the words that you use, the kind of privilege that you could receive by being in a white family. Talk a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, I mean, just as a kid, as a teenager, I only made sense in the city of Bellingham, Washington, if my parents were right nearby. So if I'm walking around holding hands with my mom at a mall, people automatically would go up to her and say, wow, what a great thing you've done. Like, they recognize that she has adopted me. And then I, therefore, am given this privilege of being in this space without having to explain myself very much. Just like, oh, okay, you're a safe Black person because you're with this woman who did this great thing, you know. But when I wasn't with my parents and I'm just a Black girl out in this city, there is caution and curiosity that people have, and kind of like a confusion, like, how did you get here? Why are you here? Who are you? kind of thing.
Yeah, and they don't just think it either. I was shocked at like how common commentary could be, like commentary at the store or commentary at a playground, and like how often families deal with these like unsolicited comments that maybe seem well-intentioned, but I think they're born of a sort of discomfort, really. People feel uncomfortable and they just like need to say something.
Yes, so often, just out on the playground, like, where'd you get them? How much did they cost? Where'd they come from?
Or like overpraising. Oh, so beautiful. Like attention, right? Like, so
goodness.
Beautiful. Look at you. You're like, I'm a kid. I'm here with my mom. Like,
Just
what's up?
the stunningness that a Black child could be well-behaved or kind or having fun on the playground or any of that is like, oh my goodness, yeah.
She's so well-spoken. It's like, well, what is
very
that? Like,
articulate.
yeah.
I'm always very articulate.
Yeah.
That gets back to the adoptee centrism because, yes, a lot of these points are just, seems like people can't even stop themselves but to gush in those ways, which are racist but well-intentioned. And so to be in the middle of that as a kid, makes you wonder, like, is there something weird about me that only a special person could have adopted me? Or is there something strange that I can speak? Am I speaking wrong? Or like, what makes me so absolutely articulate that is just mind-boggling?
Yeah.
Where are we supposed to go with those questions without appearing like we're not grateful for what we've been given? That's a lot of my work in mentorship is giving space for exploring the comments that people make that really do make us question our place.
Right. Your book's really helpful with this. I encourage people to read it to see perhaps some of the comments that they themselves may have made, because we just need to become more familiar with it. I think a lot of times it is kind of coming from a place of ignorance rather than malignance, but we've got to learn in order to not do it.
Yeah, I mean, the title, You Should Be Grateful. It's funny how often people have come up to me and been like, oh my gosh, I hear that all the time. It's the worst. But nobody is really willing to say like, oh my word, I've said that all the time.
Yeah.
And both have to be true, you know? And so I think about myself and times in my head where I've had that thought too. And within my context, if you boil it down even more, it's about poverty and how we view, like, my birth mother couldn't have possibly loved me or been a good parent since she was poor. And so, like, let's get a little bit deeper into that is kind of what I'm trying to also ask for, because it's really harmful for adoptees to grow up thinking, you know, whatever the case may be, but for me, grow up thinking because my birth mother is poor, she didn't love me. And that's the message that you get unless you really face it and name it. And that is not true.
Well, and another one is she was poor because she has some sort of fundamental character flaw, or it doesn't look at systemic injustices. It doesn't look at how generational wealth has been denied to so many Black folks in the United States. It doesn't look to systemic issues. And so I think there's also that risk of Black transracial adopted kids maybe accepting some of the stereotypes about Black communities of being like, oh, you know, well, maybe I should be grateful because stereotypes about, oh, Black people are lazy or Black fathers are absent. These sort of things that we know are really problematic, but they can be internalized, I think, by, as you say, by some of these adoptees.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about why Black fathers are absent, let's get into the penal system and how many Black men are incarcerated and how many of those men have children and how many of those men have children that they would have loved to have parented if not being imprisoned for a marijuana possession or something that isn't even illegal now, or
that their communities were over-policed compared to other, you know, to white communities. There was more policing there. There's more arrests. That criminality itself isn't inherent to race, but the way we build policing means that there's inequities in how people are imprisoned or prosecuted or sentenced. So systemic stuff.
Right, which this is something that so many people who are at that point of, I want to adopt a child, I want a baby really badly, have a really hard time thinking about the systemic issues. So if I say to someone who is in that place and perhaps they've been struggling with getting pregnant for years and this is just all they want, if I were to say, you know, why do you think a Black or brown family wouldn't be able to adopt this child instead of you, that would be so hurtful to them because they're like, what are you saying? I'm going to give this kid the best life possible. And what I'm trying to get to is systemic issues to say, what makes it such that you are able to adopt this child and a Black and brown family isn't? And it's just like a hard conversation to have at that time, given the emotionality of it all. And that's a trend that I've seen, is that it's really hard to talk about at that moment, but if they adopt like a Black boy when he turns 5 or 6 and he's experiencing racism on the playground or from even the school faculty, then those same parents come to me and are like, oh my goodness, this is terrible. This isn't fair. Like, yeah. Oh my goodness. Can't see it until, in my view, you get what you want, which is the child. And then once the legals are all completed, then there's this valve that opens up in their brain, allowing for the possibility to talk about the systemic issues.
You've had a front row seat to this too, not just as an adoptee, but also through your professional work. You began professionally working with adoptive agencies, helping to facilitate adoptions, including transracial adoptions, but that didn't seem to last very long for you.
I mean, I was 21 years old, fresh out of undergrad when I began placing children and doing transracial adoptions. And it was a really great learning experience for me. One of the things I was curious about was how the home study process works, which home study means can be like a 6-month process that if you want to adopt, you have to go through all these interviews and background checks. And I wanted to know what that was like. So I started conducting those and writing these big reports for families. And that was very enlightening, and learning also about the money. And it was perplexing to me how I would be making $32,000 a year in this role, and individual families would be paying $39,000 for an adoption to wait on a list. And I had like 50 families. So I knew there was a lot of money coming in, and where is it all going? And then I would be working with my colleagues who were supporting women who were pregnant, and for some reason we couldn't spend very much money to support their needs. And so, that was really a tricky space to be in as an adoptee, but it taught me a lot.
You seem pretty pragmatic in your approach because you recognize like issues with the adoption system and also systemic issues with regard to race in the United States, but you've also targeted your work to work directly with adoptees themselves. You've started the Adoptee Lounge, for example, which is a group that you run to help kind of discuss with transracial adoptees what their experiences are like, help young people process this together. So you've landed in a place where you've been kind of a professional in the adoption world. Then you've become more of an activist. You've also become a counselor. So do you feel at home more in that role? How did you land where you are now with this advocacy, writing books and mentoring individual people? And does it ever feel a little futile because the bigger system continues to plod on?
Totally. All of those things. I mean, I certainly could not see myself working to continue helping people adopt children. So I knew I couldn't do that. I shifted to working in post-adoption services, which is so necessary but feels frustrating because I'm no longer working at the source, although I do make attempts. But it's pretty hard to push back at every step within the child welfare industry, the adoption industry more so than foster care. I think there's a need within foster care. It's more sometimes the newborn infant adoption space, but I do some work in foster care, and that feels much more aligned with my well-being when we have clarity that a child really cannot be with their biological family. There's been abuse or harm. And so advocating for individuals to step up to support them feels better because it's less about ownership and more about just stewardship and support of a child. But landing in the adoptee space does feel a bit futile because I don't want the system to keep on churning out more adoptees. Yeah. And at the same time, I don't see it stopping anytime soon. And I do think when I'm working with adoptees who are in their 70s and 80s and they are grappling with these same things, I think, all right, there is so much healing that we can do in like us helping adoptees understand all aspects of themselves. It feels very grounding for me. It feels less adversarial. But I also am keeping my foot in that activism space. I think about the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is in front of the Supreme Court right now. And there's so many parallels to it and the National Association of Black Social Workers and their statement. And that's a really scary law that could get reversed. So I do spend some time in those spaces as well as educating adoption agencies. But working with adoptees is a beautiful space for me to be in. And, for sustainability long term, it's important.
That's Angela Tucker. We're talking about the book You Should Be Grateful, Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption. And you can also check out her story in a documentary called Closure that I mentioned earlier. And she has a podcast, The Adoptee Next Door. She also consulted with NBC's This Is Us, has over 15 years of experience working within adoption and foster care agencies, and has mentored over 200 adoptees. Angela, there's this idea that you bring up in the book, the ghost kingdom. And this is something that you got from a psychologist who coined this term. And this is kind of the imaginary worlds that adoptees construct as they're trying to make sense of a past that they don't have very many solid memories of. This ghost kingdom, this world that an adoptee can build. Give us a sense of what that is.
The ghost kingdom is, an imaginary kind of fantastical realm where, for me, I decided that my birth dad was Magic Johnson when I was really young because he's a basketball player. I'm a basketball player. He has a humongous smile. I have this big smile.
Yeah.
And so in the absence of knowing any facts about who my birth dad is, then it must be him. And my birth mom was Halle Berry because she's stunningly beautiful. I don't think I could just say that about myself, but who wouldn't want to be Halle Berry? She had similar skin tone to me. And it's just a little goofy, but it's also helpful in trying to fill in the blanks. I think it's not too different than non-adopted people who might have chosen to go to one college instead of another, and they think about what life would have been like if they chose to go to that college instead. Like, where would I be today? What would I have studied? Where would I live? Or that's the kind of place where there's nothing wrong with it. I do hope that adoptees don't have to spend much time in their ghost kingdom because we can replace it with the truth. And for me, once I found my birth parents, they are so much better than Magic Johnson and Halle Berry. Like, they are my blood, and it was unbelievable to know them. And so that's kind of what the ghost kingdom is. And it's not just adoptees. Birth parents have a ghost kingdom, especially if they don't know where their child went. And that's thinking about who their children became and where they are living and what they are doing. Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about the grief of ambiguous loss. There's a Welsh word. I don't know how to pronounce it. Hiraeth. Do you know how to pronounce it?
I learned how to pronounce it when I was doing the audiobook recording.
Oh, cool.
I'm still not very good at it, but it's Hiraeth.
Okay, yeah. It's this sense of homesick nostalgia and longing for something that is irretrievably lost, something that can't come back, something that's just gone, and maybe was never fully solid. It's this sort of ambiguous nostalgia. And as you mentioned, like, you hope that the ghost kingdoms don't need to be built as much because you're advocating for more open adoption versus closed adoption, meaning that kids can learn more about their birth parents earlier. They can know more. There could possibly be contact, because when there's not any of that, all kids have is their imagination, and their imagination can take them anywhere, really, in good ways and bad ways.
Yeah, and I think it's some adoptive parents may not recognize the hole that's filling if a child is having a huge imagination and is wanting to watch, like, Annie over and over and over and over again. That the reason is that we're essentially searching for ourselves. And so that's where let's just make it possible. And I advocate that we can always have open adoptions for every single adoption, even those where a birth parent is deceased. those where a birth parent is truly unsafe or they're in jail, that every single adoption can be open because it has more to do with what the adoptive parents have within their control, which is if you know your child, you can say like, gosh, I wonder where your traits come from. Your birth parents must be really lovers of art or great singers, or,
right.
You can really take what you see in the child and expound upon it in relation to birth family, even if you don't know them.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what creates a really wonderful space for adoptees to feel free to explore and not gaslit and not like they have to have a sheer loyalty to the adoptive parents. And so that is what I advocate when contact, like physical contact, can't be had.
Yeah, this was where This Is Us was so powerful, was seeing like Rebecca's fear that Randall's parents would sort of replace her at some point.
Yes.
This fear that he would connect with them and lose her, or a kind of possible jealousy, or that he could reconnect and maybe be hurt by a birth parent. Or there's so many feelings for the parent going through this. And you're really asking parents to make room for these other families and these other connections, which can be scary for everybody involved. But I feel that you make a powerful case, I think, that all things being equal, that it's a better approach because people, by and large, are going to have that longing regardless of what you do.
They're going to figure out how to get it at some way, even if it's like I shared earlier, the 50-year-old who's going to wait until their adoptive parents die, till they're going to find their birth parents. Like finding our roots, like I wrote in the manifesto, I think is innate. I think it's scary only because we don't have a lot of examples of it. Like perhaps it was scary at some point for a parent to think that they could love 4 children equally if they had 4 kids. Like maybe people at some point were like, wow, can that really be done? And now it's not scary. You're going to have another kid? Great, people say. How come we can't understand that for adoptees, we can love all these parents that we have, and we're not going to feel confused about who's who or who might not be safe or how to put boundaries in our lives to keep that safety. No, actually, if you, as our adoptive parents, have taught us about boundaries just in general, then allow us to use that here, too.
There's something in the book you bring up, the birth study. This is a document that you kind of held to almost as scripture, this sort of like story of your origins. This is a study that was done by social workers during the process of your adoption that talked about your birth parents. It gave clues about who they were. And it wasn't until later on when your boyfriend, now your partner, actually pointed out your possible biological father's name was included here. And this is kind of what opened the gate to you reconnecting with these folks.
Yeah, this study is a 3-page document. It's I did cling to it. Like it is still. I house it in a box in my house with things like my passport, my marriage license. It's like that important to me. And it is filled with redactions. And I didn't notice because in the era of closed adoptions, we can't know our birth parents' last name, for example, or I couldn't know her address. And so it would share my birth mother's height and weight and skin complexion, but nothing identifying. But it wasn't until my husband, then boyfriend at the time, saw this name that I had overlooked, and it was a really uncommon name. Otirius is my birth father's name. And so that allowed us to then Google and search and find this man who didn't know he had a daughter.
I hope people take the time to see in the documentary or read the book to see this story. And you had dreamed so long about meeting your mom that that your dad was sort of like, oh, yeah, there's your dad too. Okay,
Yes.
let's like check that out. But you still had that drive for your mom. And as you describe in the book, it was a lot more, it was devastating in some ways, actually. I think it's easy to romanticize and figure like, oh, this is going to be some grand reunion. But I mean, you described the first time you met her in person again, she said, she basically denied it. Like, oh, no, I'm no relation here. Goodbye.
Yeah, painful. Another reason why it's so important that we bring in systemic issues when teaching about adoption, because the thing that got me through that year where she, denied me, I don't know who you are, please leave. We were in Tennessee to find her. And so we flew back to Washington State where we live. But what got me through that year was understanding how deep shame must be for someone who was not given any support to think about what happened to her daughter. And to then think about why wasn't she given support, and to start understanding issues around poverty and how the adoption industry treats that versus treats adoptive parents who have resources and means. And I think it's partly a coping mechanism to kind of intellectualize.
You say that in the book. It was so interesting to see you psychoanalyze yourself a little bit and say, after your mom devastated you, you went through this investigation into the background and sort of thinking about the systemic issues in ways that you were processing grief intellectually, really.
Exactly. I mean, I had to be mad at something.
Yeah.
And I could not fathom being mad at my birth mother for this unexpected visitor 26 years later after giving birth at a time that must have been, I was like, yeah, that is shocking. And I can't be mad. But I am mad. So who am I mad at? And I turned it to the system and all the people that kind of failed her. But then I didn't just think about her, and I'm thinking about the bigger system and all the people who are in leadership positions and what is happening with every single adoption. So I was able to channel that grief intellectually and move on. But my gracious, when she called back a year later, that was indescribable. And she called back and said, yes, I am your birth mother, and come back and let's meet.
It is such a beautiful story. And not all stories get to have these kind of outcomes. Not, especially in the time of closed adoptions, how many people never even had this opportunity. And it's beautiful to see. You also talk a little bit about survivor's guilt because you met some siblings that you had. So some siblings that you'd never known, and kind of comparing your life to theirs. You brought a sister out to visit you in Washington, and you would go out to Tennessee, and that survivor's guilt kind of hung around for you, seeing the different lives that you might have had.
Yeah, it's hard to see that many of my birth siblings weren't raised by my birth mother either, but they weren't adopted. There's one sibling who was adopted who we are still looking for and can't find her. But the others, yeah, their lives are so much different than mine. And if I could rewrite the book, I might not use that word guilt, because I think guilt assumes a crime. You're guilty of doing something wrong. And in this case, I did not do anything wrong, nor did my birth siblings. But so I would probably work a little harder to find the right language to describe this phenomenon.
Maybe it's just like wishing better for them too, right? I mean, you're sort of seeing some of the privileges that you got because of where you were raised and who raised you comparatively. And so I like that, though, like eliminating the word guilt, because there's not culpability there.
Right.
But there is still an unsettled feeling, and sort of you wish better for them. And
I wish better for myself. I mean, I do wish that although they weren't raised by my birth mother, they knew her.
And you're connecting with your siblings now, forging new relationships there. So I can just imagine how complicated that could feel.
Yeah, I think in my birth siblings' perspective, there was a sense of wishing that they had some of what I have when they came to my hometown and saw some of the places where I grew up and met some of my friends and teachers and coaches and stuff. But at the same time, there was a wishing on my end for what they had, which even though my birth mother didn't raise them, they were raised by my birth grandmother, and got to see my birth mom on occasion and knew her name and knew the story. And so for me, there was a longing for that they knew their roots and I didn't.
It's so tempting to weigh that against each other. Like what's ultimately preferable? And
I think that's what is done in adoption. We do weigh that. We weigh, and what wins is me getting 3 meals a day and access to all the extracurricular activities and great medical care. And what loses is what my birth siblings had, which was a little more instability But to me, knowing what it's like growing up without roots, without knowing where you came from or who gave birth to you or why, like that to me means as much. But as well as the racial element, they grew up with people who look like them. I didn't get to see anyone who looked like me for years. So far, what has won out is what the adoptive parents are able to give. And I'm trying to press back against that a little.
I also appreciated how you talked about your birth mother, how she might have been feeling. You spent more time, it seems, after you met her, thinking about reasons why she might not have wanted to reconnect, or maybe just had conflicted feelings about it, maybe I should say, and empathizing more now that you'd met her and kind of come to know her more as a person, that story could fill in more for you about what she might have been up to and why.
A bit. It's very hard for her to articulate all of this, especially with me having white parents. And when I asked her how many relationships she'd had with white people, how many positive relationships she'd have with white people growing up, she's like, I could count it on one hand. So for me to think like, okay, and here come my parents who want to show her love, but clearly she has to be projecting upon them what she has experienced from so many other white people in the Deep South. It's really cool now to see their relationship. Like my parents went on a road trip to the South and sent me pictures of hanging out with my birth mom in Biloxi, Mississippi, and taking her out to eat. And they just had fun. And I love that. And it has taken a decade, but my birth mother really trusts them now. And that's that relationship is so healing for me to see.
I was really moved by something you said about your mom. She didn't express to you her reservations about you kind of meeting your birth mom, that she just showed support for you and was there for you, and that she did have worries and things. And you suggest that maybe if she did share that with you, that it might have dissuaded you from pursuing things. It might have prevented you from having this amazing reconnection, and to swallow her own vulnerability, or not swallow, but keep it inside so that you could have more freedom to pursue what you needed. That's pretty amazing.
It's pretty beautiful. I wish I could just categorize it as parenting, like I would like for it to be in that same category of parents sacrifice for their kids in many ways and all these times, but I think this one does feel a little more unique. I don't think that my mom just swallowed what I now know articulates at the time as a fear of being replaced. She had a little fear, but she didn't tell me. I don't think she just swallowed it. I think she just talked to the other people about it, but didn't talk to me about it because she knew that I wouldn't want to hurt her and I wouldn't want to put her in that place. And it's incredible that she gave me the freedom to not have that burden and move forward. And she worked through that fear on her own, and I'm so grateful for it. I absolutely believe that that's the reason that I'm in a relationship now.
Let's talk about the Sonder sphere. This is an interesting term that you bring up in the book, and because you're an advocate for more open adoptions, even though adoptive parents might fear competition or whatever, you suggest that the ways we imagine our connections to each other can help quiet our fears like that, and also offer a more stable experience for adoptees. So I'll invite you to read a section from the book here on page 166. This is a section that kind of talks about this Sonder sphere, if you would. I appreciate that.
I call it the Sonder sphere, a word I made up based on a term coined by John Koenig in his Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. He defines the word Sonder as the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own, populated with their own ambitions, friends, routines, worries, and inherited craziness, an epic story that continues invisibly around you like an anthill sprawling deep underground with elaborate passageways to thousands of other lives that you'll never know existed. The Sonder sphere is a realm where every person in an adoptee's life has a place, where birth parents and adoptive parents and biological aunties and foster parents and adoptive cousins all exist together. They don't necessarily share a home like some awkward reality TV show, but instead share an orbit around the adoptee. The Sonder sphere is a real-life antidote to the adoptee's ghost kingdom, a place where their questions can be answered in real time, where their identity can bounce around and try things on for size, where they always belong because all the parts of their story are visible and accessible to them.
So, the Saunders sphere. This is a wonderful way to conceive of it. I just want to hear more from you about what this idea has done for you in your own pursuit as you've reconnected with your family members and as you work with transracial adoptees in your professional life.
Currently, openness is the preferred terminology and method. But when you're working in an adoption agency, what openness actually looks like is giving the adoptive parents a document that they fill out that says, we will contact birth parents 4 times a year, or we'll send a letter with some photos to the adoption agency quarterly, and then the agency can pass it along. Like that constitutes openness. And sometimes those contracts are written for the next 18 years of a kid's life. And so I am suggesting that is really unreasonable for anyone to make relationship decisions for the next 18 years. And
yeah, wow.
Instead, this Saunders sphere accounts for the ebbs and flows that are natural in a relationship. So currently, if an adoptive family has this kind of openness contract, sometimes they'll call me up and say, like, you know, the birth mom disappeared for 8 months. We have not heard a thing from her. So everything's off. You know, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah.
In the Saunders sphere, I'm trying to reframe that to say all of us go through times where we might need a little break, or we might go off the grid for one reason or another.
Mm-hmm. It could even be health issues or something. Like, who knows?
Who knows what it is? But what I do know is that it's human. And so can we allow for just the humanity, especially in an extremely emotional and vulnerable relationship like this one, but that the humanity is not just accepted, but it's like we embrace it, just like we would with any uncle that we have who goes in and out of our lives. So my hope is that it just can give a more human portrayal for everyone involved, and that only is going to be helpful for kind of all of humanity. If we can finally see all of ourselves as not one-dimensional. I think this is for birth parents too. I hear birth parents, when they are talking about openness, they'll say things like, my kids' adoptive parents are perfect. They have this white picket fence, they have a grand piano, they have 2 Labrador retrievers, and life is perfect. And for them too, I'm like, no, no. Yeah. The adoptive parents have quarrels, they struggle, they have fights, they love your kid, but no, everything is not perfect. And that's currently the system that we've designed.
I really appreciate the attention you give to being more supportive of birth moms in general, that the amount of resources that we put into foster and adoption, that there might be a reckoning we could do to see if there are more social supports we could give to mothers and to fathers or to couples or single individuals who are having children, to support them in having children and keeping them and raising them if possible, the kind of systemic interventions that could help, instead of so many resources going on the other side of things in adoption and fostering.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty wild. People sometimes ask, how did your birth dad not know about you? Like, they're like, I can understand how your birth mom might have hid the pregnancy and stuff, but how did his rights get legally terminated? And so I share how that process works, which is for my birth father and many men, that an attorney will put an ad in a paper, and that ad needs to run for a couple months. This varies by county, but an ad might say, like, did you know so-and-so, and were you at this place on this date? And if so, call us. My birth dad never picked up the paper, much less like the classified section where the font is size 8 and nobody reads that.
Yeah.
So once that is, the ad runs, that's essentially giving them an opportunity to step forward, even though they may never see it. And then John Doe's rights are terminated. So they terminate every single man in America's rights to parent me.
What's your wish list for legal issues? Like, if there's 1 or 2 big things you would change legally, what would those be for the system itself?
One of them is the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act is really troublesome. It basically says that any adoption agency that receives federal money cannot mandate that prospective adopters take courses around cultural competency, that it can only be an extra. Like, if you want to learn about this stuff, then great, but you don't have to. That has got to change because I do feel like cultural competency is as important as feeding a child. So that would be great to start. The other part of that act, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, requires agencies to work harder to recruit Black and Brown families to become adoptive parents. It's not a measurable part of the law. And so agencies, even the agencies who know about this law, will just say, like, you know, how are we supposed to do that? We tried.
Right.
And so I'd love to see some sort of measurable items be added to that to show how agencies can change things to start attracting more Black and Brown parents.
It sounds like we need some more creativity there. I mean, you're a transracial adoptee yourself. You love your parents. You have an amazing story, but you've also experienced turmoil and tension and cultural issues because of transracial adoption. So, like we said at the beginning, it's a bit of a minefield in recognizing the strengths and gifts of parents who transracially adopt and the strengths and gifts of transracial adoptees themselves, and also some of the downsides of that. And I think cultural competency training would be a good start, but also, as you said, making adoption more equalized and seeing a greater diversity of adoptive families themselves seems like a pretty good place to start.
Yes.
That's Angela Tucker, author of You Should Be Grateful, Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption. All right, Angela, we always like to close with a question about regrets, challenges, and surprises. And you mentioned a regret a little bit earlier about, not using the words guilt, survivor's guilt. That's an interesting regret. If you have any other ones, you can bring them up now, or if you can think of anything that challenged you in writing this book, any obstacles that you faced, and then anything that surprised you, some new discovery or new way of seeing the issue. And this is a choose your own adventure. You can speak to all three of those, or you can pick one of them. It's really up to you.
Well, let me talk about a challenge. When I began writing the book, I just was asking my birth mom questions about her time when she was pregnant, when she kept it a secret. How did you keep it a secret? Did anybody know? When did you find out? How'd you get to the hospital? Did somebody drive you there? Where did you go after you gave birth to me? Did you have a home? I was asking her all these questions, and her answer was basically like, I don't know. I don't remember. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know. And so I was like, okay, I just need to work with that. Like, it's twofold. It's one, emotional for me, but then two, to write this book. How do I do that? At some point, I toyed with the idea of writing a fictionalized version. And so I said to my birth mother, let's just say there's this character named Deborah, which is my birth mother's name, who finds herself pregnant and needs to get to the hospital, but nobody knows, like, how would she do that in this book? And she just started telling me stuff about herself. She still couldn't remember a lot, but when I fictionalized it, it was different. It wasn't just, I can't even go there. And that was profound. I mean, it was the separation that Deborah needed in order to get a little closer. It made me sad because I thought, somebody give her a therapist, because this is just, if I could be her therapist right now, I think we could unlock so much of her trauma and shame. But anyways, it was a tactic that I just threw out there, and I'm grateful I didn't have to fictionalize, but I did learn a lot, and I didn't put all that I learned from her in that moment in the book, just to keep her integrity. But that was a major surprise through the writing process.
Overall, did you find it hard to talk so personally? I mean, the book's really personal. It also has some great theory. It's got some great connections with other folks, but it's also really personal too. Was that challenging for you, or it seems like you've kind of been used to talking about your story, and maybe that comes along with being an adoptee, where people already feel like they have access to your story.
I think there's that for sure. I enjoyed writing. I really loved that process. It was quiet and thoughtful and pensive, and I didn't have the naysayers and things that I do when I speak about my story online or in other formats, and people can right away be like, what are you talking about? And they come at me. But so I loved it. The part where I found myself feeling emotional was when I was reading the audiobook, surprisingly enough, that I had moments where I was just like, what happened? Like, I wrote these words, but I had to take some breaks, and that was a surprise.
I just got one more for you, and this connects to perhaps another episode. You talk about how you and your partner chose not to parent, at least so far, as of the time of writing of the book. And we'll have other episodes that talk about single adults and married folks who choose not to have kids. Do you think that's connected to your experience of adoption? Yeah. Or is that just something you kind of feel like is related to a lot of different things?
I certainly think it's connected. Being child-free by choice is something I'm proud of, but I know I often get questions, why would you do that? You and your husband have the resources and the love and all of these things. But I love being an auntie to so many. I love being a mentor. I think my and Brian's, our kind of ethos has a lot to do with the poem that I quoted at the beginning of the book by Khalil Gibran called On Children, where we don't believe that parenting needs to look like ownership of a child, but we can be in people's lives in a way that helps them thrive. And so we do that. We have people who live in our home with us who we aren't related to, but we can support in certain ways, and they can view us using whatever term they want. And that feels really in alignment with us. We love doing that.
That's cool. Well, as I said, people can check out another episode that'll kind of talk about that issue. Really appreciate, Angela, you taking the time to talk about your book. You should be grateful. It's a phenomenal book, a really helpful and eye-opening book.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Relationscapes, where we're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other. If you're enjoying the show, I hope you'll take a few minutes to rate and review it in Apple Podcasts. Bonus points if you recommend the show to a friend, because word-of-mouth advertising is actually the #1 way that independent podcasts like mine grow. Thanks to Mates of State for providing our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm Blair Hodges, and I'll see you next time.